So today we're going to spend some time talking about nutrition and metabolic adaptations. This is a really interesting topic because it's actually something that pops up in the media quite a bit, and yeah, it's just kind of an interesting topic. So in general, your body wants to regulate energy storage, right? So if you wanted to, you could view life history as an allocation of energy across life. Like, at what point in time do you put energy towards reproduction? At what point, sorry, there's a dog drinking water. For whatever reason, Edison always wants to drink water right when I start talking about my slides. I don't really know what's up with that. So yeah, basically life history can be viewed as the allocation of energy across life. And like, at what times in your life do you put your energy towards growing and becoming larger? And at what points in time in your life do you put your energy towards reproduction? What time do you put it towards cell maintenance, right? So energy storage is an important component of that because at some points in time you want to store energy. This is typically fat deposits, and fat deposits are an involved mechanism, right? This is largely regulated by what's known as the adipoinsular axis, and basically what happens is it's regulated by two hormones, specifically leptin and ghrelin. Leptin basically acts on the hypothalamus to decrease food intake and decrease insulin release, and so those two things broadly together cause fat deposits to decrease. So if leptin is released, that's typically your body saying, right now, we don't need to take any food, we don't need to store energy, right? If leptin levels are low, typically that stimulates increased food intake and increased insulin secretion, which typically causes fat deposits to increase, right? Yeah. Um, The other hormone that regulates this is ghrelin. Ghrelin, when it's released, causes an increase in hunger, right? And it's interesting enough, but ghrelin also interacts with cortisol. So with chronic stress, like prolonged long-term stress, ghrelin levels are increased, which is why if you're stressed out, that's why people stress eat, right? Because they're exposed to long-term chronic stress. But interestingly enough, in an acute stress, it's actually decreased. So if you have a rapid, immediate stressor, your body doesn't increase the ghrelin. It's only for prolonged acute stress, which kind of makes sense. Like, if you're going through a prolonged stressor, you want to take in as much food as you can because you have to, at some point in time, prepare to fight whatever it is that's stressing you, or you need to store up energy as much as you can. So from an evolutionary point of view, that actually makes a lot of sense. But if you're running away from a tiger, you don't want to be hungry, right? So part of the problem that we run into is that at this point in time in our society, you're basically only exposed to chronic stressors. Very few acute stressors exist in our society. So in general, we don't really know what pre-agriculture societies ate. We can do some inferences on them, but we can't really know for a fact, right? So at best, we're speculating. And part of this is we just don't know. There's no true hunter-gatherer. There's hunter-gatherer societies that exist out there, but none of them have been untouched by modern society. We've had contact with them, and even studying them is contact with them. So how much of their diet has been altered? By definition, civilization centers were probably some of the most productive areas. So whatever ancestors we had in whatever area you came from, whatever they were doing in the pre-agriculture society is probably what they were doing in like Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Tigris and Euphrates, or the Yellow River, right? Those are some of the major agriculture centers. And so we can't really know what they're doing because there's no hunter-gatherers that exist in those areas anymore, just because that's where human civilization began, right? The cradles of civilization were probably some of the most productive areas. So their foraging habits are going to be different than a lot of the modern hunter-gatherers who kind of live in areas that are rather inhospitable, if you think about the Inuit and the Aborigines, right? But we can take a look around, and they do provide us with some information, but we kind of just have to know that it's not perfect information. Once you accept that and move on, you try to make the best inferences you can, and you move on. If we look at primates, so if you go a little bit broader and you look at primates broadly, most primates are frugivore, herbivore, or insectivore. Very infrequently, they'll be carnivores. I believe baboons will be carnivorous, and I know highland chimpanzees will be carnivores, and they will actually perform cannibalism. But it's largely just opportunistic supplementation of their diet. It's not like a critical component. Early humans were very likely opportunistic. They ate whatever they could eat. You know, if mangoes are in season, we're eating mangoes, right? If you kill a big animal, then you're eating that big animal possibly for months. So their diet was very varied. Most likely the first hominids were scavengers and not actually hunters. We are not great predators. Our predation strategy is basically to walk things to death, or jog them to death, I guess you could say. And that wasn't developed until probably like Homo erectus or Homo sapiens, something like that. And they were likely nomadic. In general, one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later is that humans have a small gastrointestinal tract compared to a lot of other closely related organisms. And in particular, our small intestines are much larger and our large intestines are much smaller, which is a little bit confusing, particularly even when you look across other primates. And that's important and that's relevant, and we'll talk about why later. I just want to start off right at the top. The paleo diet is a marking tactic, and it probably has nothing to do with what Paleolithic people ate. I don't know how they got the resources. They're selling processed food for the most part. Anything that's marketed as paleo is still a processed food. In general, from what I understand, dietitians have found that a varied diet, about 25% lean meat, the rest made up of fruits and vegetables and complex starches, is the ideal diet. Mediterranean diet. Look up the Mediterranean diet. That's what you're supposed to be eating, and limiting processed foods. But this is not a nutrition course, so whatever. So just because my dog's going to take a drink of water. 100%. I think the second I start talking, he thinks I'm talking to him, and so he comes over and is like, "Oh yeah, what's Master up to?" And then he's like, "Oh, I may as well get a drink of water." Anyway, so we talked a little bit about modern foraging societies. There's a list of them over on the right, and like they're really interesting, right? But we talked about some of the reasons why we can't look at what they do and say that's what Paleolithic people did. But you can look at them, you can provide information. In general, almost half of their calories come from hunting, but that's highly variable. It's something like 99% is the Inuit people, like 99% of their diet comes from meat and hunting, and the lowest limit is like 25%. Their gut biome is incredibly diverse, and we'll talk about that later. In general, their diet is very high in fiber, and it's low in glycemic index, but we'll talk about glycemic index later. And it's also low in salt. Salt historically was actually really important. It is important for survival, right? If you don't get enough salt, you die, period, right? And you would think that something that makes up like 3% of all the world's oceans would be pretty easy to come by, but it's not exactly as easy to come by as you would think. There are areas, like inland areas, where salt was more valuable than gold, because you can't live off a gold bar, but you do need salt to survive. So, Paleolithic people, basically the end of that was what's known as the Neolithic Revolution, which is kind of the start of like relatively modern age, right? This is ancient societies. 12,000 BCE was the first one of the agriculture societies to develop. which the book says is in the Middle East, but the graphic to your lower right actually says it was in the eastern United States or West Africa. I don't really know. 12,000 BCE, the population was right around 5 million people, and agriculture actually developed independently in multiple different areas. So it's not something that was like a huge, it was something that was developed independently. So it seems like it probably was an inevitable outcome of our evolution. And so the different agricultural societies are organized around different staple crops. So in East Asia, it's rice. Central America, it's maize or corn. South America is potatoes. West Africa is sorghum, and New Guinea is hams. And you'll notice that each one of those are different types of starch. And starch are kind of tend to be the staples that we use or that we say. So one of the most interesting paradoxes of the Neolithic Revolution and farming in general is that it actually made a lot of different things much more worse for society, right? Like when crops are good and things are good, life rolled on, people ate really well, all that different types of stuff. My dog's gonna drink water again. Every time I stop and start. All right, but even if you are living in an area that has a relatively stable water supply, you still are exposed to famine. It could be pest-induced famine, or it could be weather-related famine, or it could be a variety of different things, right? Monocultures are prone to failure, and agriculture is broadly dependent upon water supply. And so if any of those things get out of whack, then bam, you have famine, right? And if you have investment in an area and all of a sudden your area becomes really poor for agriculture, do you leave that investment to go somewhere else, or do you stay? I mean, if you want to read about that tension, just read The Grapes of Wrath, and that will, like that encapsulates it. And even though it's a relatively modern book, it still does describe the tension of like staying on something you invested in versus leaving. It also resulted in a less varied diet, right? Like if the vast majority of your calories are all of a sudden coming from corn or sorghum or whatever, you have a less varied diet. This likely reduced our gut biome, right? Or reduced our gut biome, which has had consequences that we'll talk about a little bit later. It has allowed for increased reproductive success. You don't have to wait as long between reproductive events if you're not moving around as much, right? Because nomadic people, basically, you can't have another baby until your last baby is old enough to walk and keep up with the tribe. Otherwise, you'd have to carry 2 babies. And so, but with farming, that's not exactly the case. You can have a toddler and you can have an infant at the same time. And actually, having more children was an advantage because then they become farmhands who can help out with some of the chores. The other downside is that it causes the increased risks of infection, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about coevolution, but like a lot of our diseases actually come from cattle that we raise. Additionally, we've actually given some viruses to animals as well. So like apparently distemper actually moved from humans to animals. But again, we'll talk about that later. The last thing that's really interesting is it allowed the division of labor. So if you have somebody who is a farmer, instead of everybody being a hunter-gatherer, right? Like that's everybody's job is being a hunter-gatherer. If you have somebody who is a farmer who can produce abundance of food, you can have people who do things for the farmer and then trade those resources. Like you can make baskets for the farmer to store his grain in, or you can make clothes for the farmer to wear, right? And then you set up a trade society. This division of labor allowed for the specialization of and caste development, right? So now you have farmers, you have merchants, you have producers. Ultimately from this, you have to create a system of organization, right? And then once you have a system of organization, you have politicians, okay? Kings, queens, princes, dukes, all that cool stuff are basically politicians of the ancient era. This also allows for the creation of religion, right? So the religious class and the political class are very closely tied, and they always have been, and they probably, I don't know, probably always will be. I haven't seen any evidence they're not going to be. And then the religious class actually gives rise to the medical class, right? Because most of the early attempts at medicine, all the way up until Hippocrates, were basically various different types of faith healing. Hippocrates was one of the first one to look at it a little bit more systematically, and he developed like the concept of the four humors and all that stuff, which is still not exactly like high science. But like the Neolithic Revolution, that division of labor is basically how our society was constructed. Um, which is, again, we've talked about this concept of the extended phenotype. The existence of division of labor allows for a lot of our things in our extended phenotype. And also like scholars and teachers and religion and entertainers and all these different things. So all of that wouldn't really be possible without farming, without the Neolithic Revolution, which is, it's an interesting dichotomy that like famine, war, and pestilence are a result of farming, but so is like art, culture, history, philosophy, science, math, medicine. All those things are also indirectly a result of farming. So yeah, real interesting. In general, modern society, the argument is put forth that it's basically we are well fed, but we're poorly nourished, right? Um, we have abundant supply of food. Like I can go to the grocery store and I can buy anything I want right now. I can buy 15 pizzas, come home and eat it. And so like I have plenty of food, but nourishment is much more challenging. And like the dichotomy between those two things is a really, really big problem facing our society. And food supply is a huge problem that ties in economics and logistics and public health interventions and all this different stuff. Um, and it's a really, really complicated, dichotomy. China is a really, really stark case study. China has basically moved from a transition from like a farming-based economy to a global economic power, and it happened in like 20 or 30 years. Well, about 50 years. So like from the 1970s to 2020. Like the first McDonald's I think opened up in China probably around the 2000s or something like that. And so, I mean, they had access to like processed foods prior to that, but in the 1970s, a lot of their food supply was relatively local, um, and it was a lot of people were working in farms. Fast forward about 20 years, the vast majority of people are working in production or office jobs, right? And so they're working much more sedentary jobs, and their food supply is much more reliant upon processed foods. And so basically, it's the evolution of every, like what has happened in the United States, and Europe, and areas, Japan, and all that different stuff. Like what happened in China is basically what happened everywhere else, but it happened really rapidly, really rapidly. And so they're seeing a really, really rapid increase in obesity. So if you look at the chart on the left, you can see the chart in the lower left-hand corner is broadly showing how much meat is consumed in tons, right? And you can see China is relatively low in the 1970s all the way up into the 1980s, and then from the 1980s it just absolutely skyrockets. And so most people all across the world are showing an increase in the amount of meat that's been eaten, but China has been a much more rapid increase. It's really interesting, the dip in meat consumption right around 1989 in Europe. Wonder what was up with that. But you've also seen obesity rates increase tenfold in 20 years. They went from about 2.2% in the 1970s all the way up to 21% in, I believe that's 2009 was when they pulled those data. So a tenfold increase. And by the way, obesity rates in the United States are 40%. So I'm not like picking on the Chinese or anything like that. It's just a microcosm of what has happened in many other places. And to see that rapid of an increase People like to blame obesity on individuals and say, well, they just need to eat better and they need to exercise. And like, yeah, diet and exercise can help, but it also like there's a lot of societal pressures that make that incredibly challenging to do, right? It's incredibly challenging to diet and exercise in today's modern society just because the foods that are available to you and are relatively cheap are not very good for you, right? Like, you can feed a family of four on boxed macaroni for like $50 a week. I'd have to do the actual math, but to like feed them an actual healthy, varied diet, you would have to spend, 4 or 5 times that to get them, good vegetables and stuff like that. So there's socioeconomic problems, there's access problems, particularly in rural communities. This is actually a really big problem, which is a little bit ironic because rural communities produce the food. But like when I go to my hometown, a lot of my friends or a lot of the people who never left my hometown, like they shop at the Dollar General for groceries, which is just, it blows my mind. I would never think about grocery shopping at the Dollar General, just because the food supply, the food that they have there is all processed and poor quality. But the grocery store in town has very limited options. Like living in Rochester, we have access to really good food relatively easily, and we are the exception. We are not the rule. So that's a huge, huge problem. And there's definitely a lot to be talked about in terms of like the sociology of obesity. And I intend to link some articles that discuss this. But it's a big deal. And it's a big problem that it's causing health outcomes. And we'll talk about it a little bit more. All right, I had to think a little bit about what I wanted to talk about on the slide. And so, like, if you go back and you look at the four diets, I said that it was more varied. If you look at the amount of meat that they eat, though, there's incredible variability, 25% to 99%. So it seems like the lower limit of meat consumption for humans tends to be right around 25%. And part of the reasons for that is because you need certain essential amino acids that come only from meat. Like we can't get them from, it's difficult to get them from plant sources. And so like vegetarian is obviously possible, right? But vegetarians have to be intentional about consuming complete proteins to supplement their diet. Like a lot of them have to eat beans and nuts to get the essential amino acids that they don't get from just like regular vegetables and stuff like that. So it's possible to have a vegetarian diet. It's just very, very complicated to do so. And like a variability of food and variety of food, even in rural agriculture areas, makes vegetarianism possible, but it was likely not possible for a foraging society, particularly when for long periods of the time you're probably eating preserved meat. Like that's what you survived on over the course of winter, whatever you could preserve through the winter, right? And meat actually does preserve fairly well. You stick it in salt, you freeze it, you dry it out, and it will stay shelf stable for at least 6 months, right? So the interesting thing is, you've probably heard that a high meat diet is associated with various different diseases, particularly heart disease and colon disease, right? And so we're supposed to stay away from a high meat diet, right? The modern person eats about 15% meat for part of their diet. So it's interesting that, a high meat diet in Western civilization correlates to these diseases, but yet at the same time, we're eating less meat than hunter-gatherer societies, and they have virtually no instances of heart disease and colon disease. And part of it is their activity levels are higher, but that's not the complete story. Okay? I made the point I wanted to make on the last slide. Like foraging societies tend to have low rates of heart disease, colon cancer, even though they eat more meat than like modern society diets do. And so as it turns out, not all meat is created equal, right? So these images, the lower left-hand corner, that's what venison looks like. If you've never seen what venison looks like, that's what venison looks like. Very, very, very low fat, right? Very low fat. Beef, the middle one, has much higher fat. You can see that marbling in there, right? And then on the right, that's Wagyu beef, right? Like it's really good. I've never tried it myself, but I've heard it's incredibly tender. Um, and I'm sure it's delicious, but like you can see the difference in fat content in those meats. Like you're supposed to avoid fatty meats in general. Like your diet, you talk to any dietitian, talk to any nutritionist, they'll say avoid fatty meats like beef and pork. Focus on meats like chicken and fish and stuff like that. And like if you could find venison, venison is really good for you. Bison, elk, stuff like that. Additionally, corn-fed meat tends to be higher in fat. Um, Cows weren't really bred to eat corn. Like that's not their ancestral diet. They're grain. They want to feed on like grasses and stuff like that. And so like they can turn corn into energy, but they tend to do it at a very high conversion to fat, which makes them taste delicious. Don't get me wrong. They taste delicious, but like that's not necessarily good for you. So the book had a great image showing this, right? Um, this basically shows the fat content of various different types of meat, and you can see that antelope, deer, elk, I don't know what an eland is, are all right around 20% to a little bit lower. Pasture-fed beef is right around 21%, right? Grain-fed steer is like 37%, so it is much higher, right? But it's also cheaper, right? So then you have this socioeconomic conversion, right? Not everybody can afford pasture-fed beef, right? It's more expensive because you have to have large swaths of land to support them. And so, like, if everybody in our society switched over to pasture-fed steer, a lot of people in our society would not be able to eat it at all, just because it would supply and demand economics. So that's, a huge problem. And it's not just the amount of fat, it's also the composition of the fat, right? So the book goes into a little bit more details, but this image shows you like the differences in saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. Polyunsaturated fats are they're fats that have multiple different um, double carbon bonds, right? Monounsaturated fats have one double bond, and saturated fats have none. So like you guys have probably all heard that basically you're supposed to eat unsaturated fats. Polyunsaturated fats are better for you than monounsaturated fats even. And like monounsaturated fats are better for you than saturated fats. But if you look at grain-fed versus pasture-fed, you can see there's a huge increase in both saturated and monounsaturated fats. So it's actually the type of fats you find in grain-fed beef is actually worse for you overall too, right? So like it's kind of a double whammy there. So if you broadly look at like metabolic disorders, so diabetes is probably the easy example of a metabolic disorder. Across our society, there's been a huge increase in them, and like a lot of it is driven by older people, and metabolic disorders tend to be a disease that's relatively of old age. But we have also seen an increase in people who have a metabolic, like that pink line at the bottom is people from 0 to 44 years of age, and that one's going up as well, right? So it's not just old people driving this increase, but we are starting to see more and more people with metabolic disorders who are at a younger age, right? And so, like, these are some of the consequences likely of a couple different processes. The first one, which is the food that we're exposed to, the type of food we're exposed to. And we'll talk a little bit later about other explanations for it that are not placing blame on individuals, right? Um, So we've talked previously about meat, and not all meat is the same. There's another concept known as glycemic index, and glycemic index is really, 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 really important, right? So if you look at glycemic index, the more fiber there is in a food, the longer it takes your body to digest it. If it takes longer to digest, that means that it's not going to spike your blood sugar as much, right? And also the amount of fats actually has an impact on it too, but I'm going to ignore that because it kind of confuses the message, right? So if you look at foods that are, basically found in the produce aisle, right? Like complex carbohydrates that are full grain, grapes, cashews, soybeans, true grain products, an apple, oranges, stuff like that. they tend to be high in fiber, which means it takes your body longer to process them. So even if they have the same amount of sugar, and I'm not talking about carbohydrates, the same amount of sugar, it will cause your blood sugar to spike less, okay? As opposed to processed foods like pure glucose, right? Like your body doesn't need to do anything to pure sugar to absorb it, right? It can just take it right into the bloodstream if you're eating pure glucose. So like that would be the highest glycemic index thing, right? Sucrose and other sugar, fructose, other sugars like that are also pretty high glycemic index, right? So if you look at these things, right, it doesn't see, you would think intuitively that if you eat an apple that has 25 grams of carbohydrates, sugars, whatever, and if you eat the equivalent amount of corn chips that have the equivalent amount of carbohydrates in them, you would think they would affect your blood sugar the same. But they don't. Because the apple has the fiber in it, it will cause your blood sugar to spike less. And so that's that graph on the left. Like they took a bunch of diabetics and they fed them different foods. They almost always do this to diabetics because diabetics have problems regulating their sugar, so you can actually learn a lot about them, okay? And so if you give them pure glucose, right, and you measure it, their blood sugar, it looks like they're measuring it every, well, it looks like actually at 30, 60, 120, 180. So it looks like every half hour until the hour, and then every hour thereafterwards, and they calculate these data points. Glucose, within an hour, your blood sugar is going to spike to 140, and then it's going to come back down, and you're below 100 by right around 75. And actually, I doubt these were diabetics, just looking at the numbers. If you feed them something like oatmeal, right? You can see the blood sugar doesn't spike nearly as much. It only goes up 20 milligrams, and then it really doesn't get any higher than 30, and it reaches its peak at 2 hours instead of 1 hour, right? And so like that spike in sugar is what causes your body to dump a bunch of insulin. If your body dumps a bunch of insulin, then it will eventually become more resistant to insulin, and then you have type 2 diabetes. So like glycemic index is incredibly important. And like if you look at the glycemic index, you will notice that like foods that are good for you that nutritionists recommend tend to be what you should eat. Apples, oranges, bananas, stuff like that. Although there are a couple weird ones in there too that you wouldn't think about. Pumpkin. I didn't know pumpkin was that high. Squashes in general. Okay, so like think about this and like take a look at a glycemic index and think about what type of foods you eat. If you eat foods that have a high glycemic index, you're putting yourself at risk for type 2 diabetes. And actually, I'm sitting here staring at an apple right now that is probably going to be my mid-morning snack. Delicious and nutritious, and it is low in glycemic index. All right. So a lot of people have heard of the thrifty genotype, right? And the basic idea is because famine was prevalent back in the Paleolithic ages, it's important for us to have genes that store fat, and that's why we have a thrifty genotype, right? We've been selected for a thrifty genotype. There's a couple problems with this theory, and it's largely been discarded. So first things first is what genes? Where's the genes, right? We've sequenced the human genome. We found a bunch of genes. Any of the genes with the strongest effect only explain like 1% of fat storage, right? So it just doesn't seem like, without any genes that we can point to that have a really strong effect, it doesn't really seem like that's the thing going on. And then the other thing about it is like, did cavemen actually experience famine, right? We've talked about this a little bit previously. If you are a hunter-gatherer and like you're having a hard time finding food, you go somewhere else and you go find food somewhere else. So it's incredibly likely that our ancestors, our Paleolithic ancestors, really didn't experience that much famine, because if they were experiencing famine, they left, right? So it's completely possible that the central premise of that argument is completely wrong. The last thing you need to consider is it a long enough period of time, right? So like, we have millions of years of evolutionary history where they're hunting around and famishing and all that different stuff. So then you can make the argument that the famines we're exposed to in the Neolithic Revolution, um, they started to select for thrifty genotypes. And so, like, you're talking about 12,000 years of evolution. So is 12,000 years of evolution enough to offset millions of years of evolution? And probably not, okay? There have been some examples of really, really rapid change in genes. So, for instance, the graph in the upper right-hand corner shows genes associated with sickle cell anemia that we talked about previously. Those have all arisen within the last probably 50,000 years, if I had to put a finger on it. Lactose persistence, that's the lower right-hand corner. Those are relatively recent genes, of example of really, really rapid evolution. And then blue eyes is another example of rapid evolution. So like maybe if there's a strong enough selective pressure for it, but not necessarily. So it's kind of one of those things, like the whole thrifty genotype doesn't make sense on a couple different levels, and we've kind of moved past that at this point in time. So then you have an alternative explanation, right? Perhaps it's more of a mismatched signals thing. And so we've previously talked about developmental cues, right? So your body was making developmental decisions when you were just a wee little itty bitty clump of cells. And that's based on environmental cues that you receive from the mother, right? And so if our environmental cues have changed, right, significantly in, say, I don't know, the last 80 years, that could be skewing the developmental cues that the mother is supposed to receive. And so they've done research on this. And so rat dams, which are pregnant females, if you feed them a low diet, their children tend to be insulin resistant and hyperactive, right? So the poor nutrition is activating a set of genes that produce a thrifty genotype or a thrifty phenotype, not a thrifty genotype, a thrifty phenotype. And also, if you take a look at individuals who were, if you look at mothers' children who were pregnant during the famine of 1944, they've actually shown that there's altered methylation, and they've looked at the genes, and a lot of those genes are associated with growth, metabolism, and cardiovascular production. So the basic idea is the fetus is getting environmental cues at a young age that's telling it it's going to be a hard world out there with not a lot of food, right? And so that can cause an altered reproductive or developmental pathway, which ultimately causes them to store fat and become insulin resistant much more likely. This basically walks you through it. Basically, the fetus perceives a challenging environment from information it's receiving from the mother, and that could be either a really poor diet. It could also be a really high quality diet or something that's really high in sugars. Could also indicate, for whatever reason, it also indicates a stressful environment, or it could be high levels of glucocorticoid. Sorry. Takes that information and prepares for this future challenging environment. And so it could be either psychological stress or it could be metabolic stress, right? It's going to reduce its muscle mass growth. Muscle mass is probably one of the tissues that takes up, like more muscle mass is one of the things that helps offset diabetes the most. It changes their preference. They want high fat, high energy food, and their metabolism tends to shift towards fat deposition instead of shifting towards growth and development. The fetus comes out and it is exposed to a high nutrient, high glycemic index diet, and so because it has a propensity to store glucose as fat, you get metabolic disorders, and you get problems with that. So that's the basic idea. Now the question I have is, what is the trigger? I can understand nutritional, right? So if we're exposed to more foods that have a higher glycemic index, okay, that means that the mother will have a higher circulating glucose levels. High glucose levels have been shown to produce offspring that are more likely to be insulin resistant and other interesting things like that. It's same as low glucose levels, right? So you want the glucose levels to be optimal. A lot of that information comes from gestational diabetes. Stress is another thing that's super interesting to me. Oh, and so the graph on the lower left, you can see the rates of gestational diabetes have been increasing. So like that could explain a large part of it. And yeah, so like that connection to me seems relatively straightforward. Stress is one that's interesting to me. So are we more stressed than our grandparents? Are we more stressed than our great grandparents? Are we more stressed than our Paleolithic ancestors? And I'll tell you, in comparison to our Paleolithic ancestors, we likely are experiencing stress in very different ways. But I don't know if we're more stressed, right? And so can the different types of stress be what causes it? I don't know. And then even if you look in the 1950s, obesity rates were much lower. So am I more stressed than my grandpa? I don't know. I don't really know how to answer this. So the graph in the lower left-hand corner is just basically, it's self-reported data on excellent or good mental health. There's not really, I wasn't able to find any data that shows cortisol levels from the 1950s to today. I just don't think that study exists. It would be interesting. There's self-reported data out there, but like, I don't know if I trust that. And so I don't know. Maybe it could be a stress trigger and it could be a combination of both. Like they're not mutually exclusive. We could have, it could be partially because of the nutritional environment we're exposed to, and in addition to the stress, it could be the stress by itself, or it could be the nutrition by itself. Like it could be either or. But I do want to know what that trigger is, and I want to know what's changed about our society. Okay, so I don't know if this is the last topic or not because I kind of lost track of my notes. But there's this idea called the expensive tissue hypothesis, and I really want to talk about it. So if you compare us to other primates, we have a relatively small gut size and a large brain. Dog's gonna start drinking water. All right, he's done drinking. We can continue. So if you look at this graph in the left, lower left, it's a graph of a bunch of different primates and a bunch of different organisms. I don't think they're all primates, but in general, you can see humans are very, very low on the gut size, and we are very high on the brain mass size. Now, the brain mass thing shouldn't throw you for a curve, but the gut size might have been like, wait a second, what are you talking about? And so the graph on the right, basically what they did was they took, they looked at a bunch of different organisms that were not humans, and they extrapolated those to predict what our expected tissues would be, right? And if you look, you can see the liver is a little bit bigger in humans than expected, but not much. The gut is much smaller, or no, I'm sorry, the liver is a little bit smaller. The gut is much smaller than expected, and the brain is much bigger than expected. And so basically they put forth this, well, hold on, I'll lay it out later, right? So if you consider the brain tissue is extremely energetically expensive. And so if you think back to anatomy and physiology, when we talked about nervous transmission, right, like it's the movement of the sodium ions and calcium ions and potassium ions and chloride ions back and forth, and the sodium potassium pump is running all the time. Something like a third of your blood goes straight to your brain, and a third of the energy your brain uses is just to run the ATP pump, right? So if you take a look at this overall, our brain accounts for 2% of our mass and 16% of our basal metabolic rate, right? So like it is disproportionately more energy expensive than any other tissue out there, okay? So the increase in brain size may have forced a decrease in gut size, right? And so if you have increased metabolic costs from your brain, right, you need to do one of two things. You can either consume more food or you can cut tissues elsewhere. And so the expensive tissue hypothesis, now he's got a squeaky toy. The expensive tissue hypothesis basically says that we decreased our gut size to increase our brain size. And this caused us to shift towards easier to digest food, particularly meat. And so if you look, and also if you look at it, it's not just the overall gut size, it's the type of gut size as well. You can see that our small intestines are much larger than a lot of our primate relatives. We barely have a cecum at all. Our cecum is relatively small. and the colon size is much, much, much smaller. So if you look at the specific functions of the small intestine and the colon is largely used to break down cellulose. Like, we don't do that well, and that's because we have a small colon. The small intestine is largely used for absorption of things that are readily easy to process, right? And so we tend to do that quite a bit, and that's largely an affect of us having a very different gut composition. So like, this entire idea that our bodies made the decision to have a smaller gut size in order to allow our brains to develop larger, it's highly controversial. This is something that's argued quite a bit. The data is correlational. You cannot determine causational data out of this. You just can't. Like, how are you going to do this experiment, right? But it's really compelling, isn't it? And so I think it's something to consider. The alternative to this hypothesis is the trade-off hypothesis. And so the basic idea is you can offset the brain energy increase by decreases in other areas, specifically maintenance, right? You can reduce locomotive costs. If you extend the developmental time frame, that means it gives your brain more time to develop, so you don't, like, chimpanzees are basically full adults by like 4 or 5 years of age, whereas like a 5-year-old child is still basically helpless, right? And so if you expend that developmental period, then you can take in, it gives you more time to develop that big brain, right? Which spreads out the cost of the tissue more, which then allows you to like live, like it's less cost per year. And then also reduce reproductive investment. Human reproduction is actually really, really inefficient. Only about 20% of couples will get pregnant if they attempt to get pregnant, and so like that could be a result of a reduced reproductive investment. So it may not have been solely the gut biome trade-off. It may have been a trade-off on multiple different structures. Or not gut biome, but gut size. This slide is about gut biome. So your gut biome significantly influences your health, right? They've done studies that shown that if you primarily have a phylum from the group Firmicutes, you have different epigenetic markers, and those markers are associated with obesity, cardiovascular disease, and inflammation. There's been a lot of really, really interesting research just showing that like our gut biome is a huge influence of our health overall. Interestingly enough, if a fetus is delivered vaginally, they have the same gut biome as their mother, but C-section babies do not. And there's also been correlational data that shows that C-section babies have higher rates of metabolic disorders, obesity, heart disease, stuff like that. It's correlational, it's not causational, so I mean, take it with a grain of salt, but it is interesting. And like, probiotics has kind of become like a really, really big catchphrase, and I'm not really sure how effective probiotics are in general. I would have to look at actual research and actual data, and I just honestly haven't done that. But like, there seems to be strong evidence, and when I'm talking about probiotics, I'm talking about like Activia yogurt. Like, is Activia yogurt better than eating just regular Greek yogurt? And also, like, even if you take probiotics, is that nearly as good as the very diet we got when we were hunter-gatherers? So a simple study, they looked at a hunter-gatherer society known as the Hazda people, and they had an average of 730 species of gut micro per person. If you take a random Californian, they just have like 277 species, right? And then they looked at some other different people, but like you can see there's a huge difference between someone living in California and like the Hazda people who are hunter-gatherer society. And like the more varied diet you have, the more diverse gut biome you have, right? So that's a complicated trade-off. And like a lot of the things in your gut biome, a lot of what they do, a lot of what happens in your large intestines is the production of various different vitamins that help your metabolism run effectively. So it's interesting. It's an area where further research is definitely needed. All right, see you in class.